Her eyes would just dart back and forth very quickly.
She would scream and kick. It seemed like she was possessed.
I was scared to death.
It was like my legs were on fire. It was the most incredible pain that I've ever felt.
I was asking myself, was he going to be able to walk again?
Next, two medical mysteries that defied the experts. When 13-month-old Alexa Jennings begins exhibiting a series of bizarre and terrifying symptoms, her parents find themselves on a desperate search for a doctor who can help their only child.
We were told we don't know what's wrong with her. That's terrifying to hear as a parent.
Then, just hours after incapacitating pain stopped marathon runner Greg Sapp dead in his tracks, a horrifying disease threatens to take over his entire body.
If it spread, I would lose the ability to breathe on my own.
I just didn't know how to handle it anymore. I was at the point that I thought I could lose my son.
In the fall of 2007, Brooks and Becky Jennings had just celebrated their 3rd anniversary and were busy building a life together in Lubbock, Texas.
We were a career couple. I worked at a food bank. I was their volunteer coordinator. Brooks was a police officer working midnight shift, so we kind of had opposite schedules there for a while, but we made it work out.
We were doing great. We were able to take vacations and go places, just spur a moment. Life was pretty good.
They were happy together. They bought their little starter house and began discussing plans for a family.
I always looked forward to the day I would have children.
And on January 15th, 2008, Becky calls Brooks when she gets some exciting news.
I said, "Where are you? I know you're on patrol. I'm going to come find you."
She jumps out of the truck and I realize she has a plastic bag, and there's 3 pregnancy tests in them, and all 3 of them are positive.
We were just thrilled that the time had come.
7 months later, on August 23rd, Brooks and Becky welcome a daughter, Alexa Catherine Grace, into their lives.
She weighed 6 pounds, 10 ounces, and she was just a perfect little baby girl.
10 fingers, 10 toes, good weight. Everything looked great.
Over the next year, Alexa always hit those developmental milestones. By October 2009, Alexa could easily take 30 to 40 steps. We loved just chasing her around the house and dancing with her.
Alexa was a very happy baby, very healthy baby. We had the perfect life.
But one morning, when Alexa is 13 months old, Becky notices her seemingly healthy daughter behaving very strangely.
I went into the kitchen to rinse out her bottle, and I expected her to follow me. I look, and she's standing at the couch, and she keeps trying to take steps towards me, and she keeps falling down. And I watched her do it probably 5 or 6 times before she gave up and started crawling towards me and just gave me this look like, "Mommy, please come help me." I found it very unusual because just the night before, she had followed me down the hall to go to bed.
Assuming Alexa's just tired, Becky puts her down for a nap. But an hour later, when the baby wakes up, the young mother is stunned by what she sees.
Every couple seconds, her eyes would just dart back and forth very quickly and then stop and settle down. It really looked like I was watching something out of a horror movie.
Frantic, Becky rushes Alexa to the closest ER, calling Brooks on the way. And once the medical team takes over, the Jennings watch helplessly, hoping for some answers.
Based on the bizarre symptoms Alexa was exhibiting, the very first thing they wanted to do was put her in a CT scan and rule out any sort of brain tumor.
It was a terrifying feeling just to go from no problems at home to emergency room to looking for any kind of tumor.
An hour later, doctors return with the results of the CT scan.
Her brain looked to be normal. There wasn't any kind of tumor at all.
It was a prayer answered, of course, but then it began a series of further questions. Okay, well, now what's going on? The symptoms were still presenting themselves, so we were moved up to pediatric ICU for more and more testing.
We had had a CT scan, we had had MRIs, blood work, urine tests, pretty much every test I could think of.
All the tests were coming back negative. Doctors were having trouble determining what was going on.
We were told, "You're the mystery patient. We don't know what's wrong with her." That's terrifying to hear as a parent.
But as the Jennings begin to wonder how much more Alexa can take, her bizarre symptoms begin to mysteriously improve.
Her eye movement slowed down a little bit. She started to get better with the balance as well.
We were happy Alexa was doing better, but we still didn't have an answer for exactly what was going on either.
With all their tests showing nothing but negative results, the medical team is left with only one possible diagnosis.
Alexa's doctors felt that she could have a viral infection causing cerebellar ataxia.
Cerebellar ataxia is the sudden onset of uncoordinated muscle movement. It's often caused by a virus of unknown origin that affects the part of the brain responsible for coordinating balance and eye movements.
Our doctor told us upon leaving that she would recover over the next 4 to 6 weeks and get back to how she was before the virus. All of her vital signs appeared to be perfectly normal. We were released from the hospital.
So we went on home, and she continued to improve. I even got back to the point of taking 5-7 steps without falling.
The eye movements probably slowed down to about 10 minutes in between on average. We honestly thought, this is it, this is what she has, she'll continue to get better, and our lives will go on as if it never happened.
But just 2 weeks after leaving the hospital, Alexa suddenly takes a horrifying turn for the worse.
Her eye movements really picked up. They would just go insane, all directions, and we noticed the balance was getting much worse. She was having such a difficult time even sitting up.
It terrified me that the same symptoms that we started with were now back with a vengeance.
Before the worried parents have a chance to react, Alexa is blindsided by a frightening new symptom.
We put her into her high chair, and we noticed her extremities, her arms and legs, started moving uncontrollably.
It was almost like somebody who had Parkinson's disease. It was just different than anything we had seen up to this point. I was scared to death.
Soon after she begins walking on her own, 13-month-old Alexa Jennings suddenly loses all sense of balance and starts experiencing bizarre, uncontrollable eye movements. While her doctors suspect a virus triggered the frightening symptoms, Alexa's parents aren't so sure, especially when her entire body begins shaking violently. Horrified, Brooks and Becky Jennings are rushing their only child to the ER yet again.
We were immediately admitted back into the pediatric ICU, and the doctor was beginning to think that maybe this wasn't a viral infection after all, and it could potentially be something else. Alexa was in the hospital overnight. We did lots of blood work, as well as a lumbar puncture to take a look at the spinal fluid and see if there was anything unusual in that.
In the morning, the findings are in, and the Jennings are completely taken aback by what they reveal.
All of her testing came back normal, and the neurologist finally told us, we just don't know what's wrong.
It was terrifying, and it felt like we were back at the beginning again. She was still showing all of her symptoms, the eye movement, the body shaking, the loss of balance. There's something clearly wrong with Alexa, but nobody just knows what it is.
At a complete loss, the medical team discharges Alexa and refers the case to a new pediatric neurologist. But Becky and Brooks' hopes for an answer anytime soon are quickly dashed.
We could not get an appointment for 3 weeks. She was still having serious balance issues to the point that she could not sit up. Her eye movements at times were so uncontrollable they never stopped. She was also having horrible shaking, and I sat there and I thought, 3 weeks from now, is she even going to be here?
Over the next 2 days, the Jennings try repeatedly to get an earlier appointment, but with no success. And to make matters worse, Alexa seems to be undergoing a strange emotional change.
Alexa began to develop incredibly violent rage fits. Tried to pull herself out of the high chair, screaming like you were stabbing her with knives. She would try with so much force to get out. I was afraid she was going to physically hurt herself.
She would scream and kick. It seemed like she was possessed.
We were reaching a hopeless point where we didn't know how much worse she could get.
My wife and I were consumed with looking for an answer on the internet, talking to friends, talking to family, looking for any possible resource that we could to help find an answer for Alexa.
And the intensive research pays off when the family finds a world-class pediatric neurology department 500 miles away in Houston.
Houston, Texas Children's Hospital was the place to go. We called and we were told that we needed to be seen immediately. We were losing time.
Eager to help his ailing granddaughter, Mike joins Becky and Brooks for what turns out to be a terrifying journey.
Alexa spent the entire ride from Lubbock to Houston screaming, crying, literally trying to break out of the car seat. It was as if something was attacking her.
My worst fear at that point was she was at a point of no reversal, and that would be the end.
Ten long hours later, the family arrives at the Texas Children's Hospital emergency room, where they're met by a team of pediatric neurologists headed by Dr. Angus Wilfong.
When I first walked in the room, you could see it on her parents' faces, and you could see it on Alexa's face. This was a very sick little girl. She was completely unable to coordinate her arms and her legs.
She had very, very bad shaking. Her eye movements were almost nonstop.
It looked like her eyes and body were dancing uncontrollably, and there are only a very few conditions that would produce those kinds of movements. And it really confirmed what we thought might be wrong with Alexa.
We were so incredibly desperate to have a name of what was wrong. We couldn't continue to still sit there in the dark and wonder.
Over the last month, Alexa Jennings has been suffering from a bizarre constellation of symptoms: fits of rage, bouts of violent shaking, almost continuous wild eye movements, and a complete lack of muscle control. Now, Dr. Angus Wilfong thinks he's cracked the case.
With the sudden appearance of these symptoms that got progressively worse over the course of a month, this really couldn't be anything other than opsoclonus myoclonus syndrome.
Opsoclonus myoclonus syndrome, or OMS, is a rare autoimmune disorder. In healthy individuals, antibodies fight off viruses and infection. But in patients with OMS, antibodies mistakenly identify the body's own brain cells as foreign substances and begin annihilating them.
In Alexa's brain, The antibodies are attacking and destroying nerve cells. When individual nerve cells become damaged or die, that impacts our brain's ability to communicate from one area of the brain to the other, and that results in dysfunction of the brain with abnormal eye movements, with the irritability, the loss of skills, and the incoordination.
All we'd been asking for a month was a diagnosis, but to get such a scary diagnosis was not what we wanted.
As Dr. Wilfong described opsoclonus myoclonus syndrome and the symptoms one after another, it made absolute perfect sense.
Dr. Wilfong goes on to explain that even Alexa's uncontrollable fits of rage are a common side effect of the disease.
Whenever something affects your coordination center, your cerebellum, children are usually very dizzy and can become very irritated. Alexa would appear enraged when they placed her in her high chair or car seat because of the dizziness and her feeling that she might fall.
OMS often takes on a life of its own, and some patients can experience brief improvements, just like Alexa did 2 weeks ago.
All autoimmune diseases like opsoclonus myoclonus syndrome are very dynamic. Symptoms can come and go, and they progress to the next stage of the disease. If Alexa had never been recognized as having opsoclonus myoclonus syndrome, she would have lost all of her ability to move her body, and she would have slipped into a coma, and she likely would have died.
We were so incredibly blessed to find Dr. Wilfong. It's hard to imagine how serious it could have gotten.
But Becky's optimism is short-lived. The young parents are dumbfounded by the bombshell he's about to drop.
The commonest cause for this condition is a malignant tumor called a neuroblastoma. It's thought that there must be something similar on the surface of the tumor cells that is similar to the surface of the cells in the brain, and the antibodies get confused, and children die from these tumors.
It was just like somebody had kicked me. It just took my breath away.
We had a good 5 minutes there where we just sat there and cried about it. And finally, I said, you know what? She has been through too much to let this take her down now. We had worked too hard to get her here to begin with, and we were gonna fight to keep her here.
This was an emergency to determine whether Alexa had a tumor. We started with a CAT scan of her abdomen and of her chest. That's where these tumors usually are. Then she had more detailed directed imaging with ultrasound.
It was so hard just waiting around to get an answer. Did we find a tumor? It was just a long couple of days.
Finally, the findings are back.
All of those tests were negative. We didn't see a tumor.
And that was music to our ears to hear no tumor was ever found.
But just because a tumor wasn't detected doesn't mean Alexa never had one.
Children can have spontaneous remissions with neuroblastomas. It's possible that the tumor went away. If that's not the case, we just don't know what the cause is.
There was a sigh of relief, but then a whole new world opened up of, okay, how do we fix it?
Unfortunately, there is no specific cure for opsoclonus myoclonus syndrome.
It's definitely a breathtaking moment. You have to step back and, is this really what I'm hearing?
You always expect in modern medicine, there's a cure for everything. I sat there and I thought, if she's deteriorating this fast, what situation are we going to be in? Is she going to make it?
Becky and Brooks Jennings have just received terrifying news. Their 14-month-old daughter Alexa has an incurable autoimmune brain disorder. opsoclonus myoclonus syndrome. However, there are treatments that can keep her rare condition in check, and neurologist Dr. Angus Wilfong is anxious to get the toddler started on one immediately.
We used very powerful intravenous corticosteroids to stop these antibodies that are damaging her brain, and we used intravenous immunoglobulin therapy, which gives you intravenous infusion of antibodies, and these antibodies will hopefully interact with the abnormal antibodies that Alexa's body is creating and slow the disease down.
We were just hoping we were coming out of the bottom of the barrel where we had been, and we were on our way up.
That afternoon, Alexa begins her first round of medications. And after 11 days in the hospital, Dr. Wilfong begins to finally see signs of improvement.
Day by day, she was less irritable. The jerks and the twitches improved as her coordination did. She still had abnormal eye movements, but they were much less noticeable. She really made remarkable progress.
Confident the treatment is working, Dr. Wilfong sends Alexa home, where her parents take over administering the medication.
About a month into her daily steroid injections, she was listening to some music and stood up and started dancing. And I hadn't seen that in a really long time.
That was my little girl that I knew. It let me know that things were going to be better.
And Dr. Wilfong is optimistic about Alexa's long-term prognosis.
Damage to the brain can have lingering developmental effects. Fortunately, Alexa is very young, so we're hopeful that she has the greatest capacity to recover from the injury.
With Alexa finally on the mend, the Jennings can't help but wonder why no other doctor could identify the horrifying disease.
Opsoclonus myoclonus is the constellation of different symptoms, and if you focus too much on just one of the symptoms, you might miss the overall picture. Also, opsoclonus myoclonus is very rare. This occurs approximately 1 in 10 million children.
Today, just 9 months after receiving the diagnosis, Alexa is on her way to a full recovery, with her parents monitoring her very carefully.
The biggest thing we have to be concerned with are germs. She's immunosuppressed, and the slightest little cold for anyone could be detrimental for her because she has no immune system.
But vigilance is a small price to pay to see their daughter happy and healthy.
Alexa is a toddler on the move. Her shaking is completely gone. Her eye movements are completely gone. Cognitively, she's as sharp as can be. It really does feel like having my little girl back now.
Alexa has come a long ways. The smile is back. The laughing is back. She's got about a dozen words that she'll say to us. We are thrilled.
I want other families to know that it's up to you as the parent to be an advocate for your child. If things aren't getting done, step up and say something about it, because nobody else is going to step in to do it.
While Brooks and Becky Jennings watched their child deteriorate day by day, Greg Sapp was struck overnight by a mysterious disease that threatened to paralyze and possibly even kill him. In the winter of 2008, 34-year-old Greg Sapp was starting his life over in his hometown of Waycross, Georgia, after a long stint in the armed forces.
I served in the Army for 8 years. I achieved the rank of sergeant, and I've served in the Middle East for 8 months.
I was very proud of him. He'd done a good job for our country.
When Greg came home, he started looking into buy a house. He stayed busy at his job.
I worked in manufacturing. I operated heavy machinery. The job was pretty demanding, but I liked my career.
And when he wasn't at work, Greg was a serious runner.
I started running when I was in the military, and I gained a love for it. I had run 1 marathon, and I was training for another. I'd run 5 days a week, between 3 and 7 miles each day. I thought I was in the best shape of my life.
But one day in early March, while he's at work, Greg notices something very odd.
I started to get this weird sensation in my right foot, like it was going numb. I thought my foot was asleep, so I took my shoe off and I massaged my foot to see if I could get it to stop, but it didn't go away. The numbness started to gradually move up my leg, and by midday it was up to my knee. I had no clue what was happening.
Despite the weird lack of feeling in his leg, Greg continues working. But by the end of the day, the sensation is even more intense.
The numbing sensation went all the way up my right leg to my thigh, and it was almost impossible for me to work. I'd have to hold on to pieces of the machinery just to be able to get around. I was having to take more breaks, and I was having to go and massage my leg. Nothing I tried helped the situation. When I went home that night, I went and laid down and tried to get some rest. I had all intentions of returning to work the next day. While I was in the Army, I was taught to pretty much suck it up and drive on.
All Greg can imagine is that he's pinched a nerve and hopes things will improve on their own. But in the morning, Greg is horrified by the state he's in.
The numbness moved all the way up to my waist, and it went down to the left thigh. When I stepped down, pain shot up my leg and went straight up to my hip. It was like a stabbing, burning feeling. It was the most incredible pain that I've ever felt. I wasn't able to feel the outside of my leg, but yet I had an intense pain. I wasn't able to stand up. I had lost all control of my legs. I knew there was no time to waste, and I knew that I needed to go to the ER. I had to crawl to the car. I used the vehicle itself to prop myself up on, and I got in my car and drove myself to the emergency room.
The hospital is only 15 minutes away, but Greg isn't sure if he can make it there.
I had no feeling in my legs, and I didn't know if I was applying too much pressure or too little pressure to the brake, and I almost rear-ended someone. I was asking myself what in the world was going on. I didn't know if I was going to make it to the ER.
"24 hours ago, Greg Sapp started to feel a strange numbness in his right leg. And then, without warning, it quickly spread across his waist and into his left leg. Now, an excruciatingly painful burning sensation has set in. Panicked, Greg is determined to drive to the emergency room, a task that proves to be almost impossible.
When I got to the hospital, they put me on a gurney and they took me straight to the ICU. People were everywhere. They were taking blood samples. They hooked me up to intravenous pain medications and called my parents.
When I first saw Greg, it was very emotional. He was in a lot of pain. I reached over and put some cover on his legs, and he screamed. Just the sheet touching him hurt him so bad.
The pain was more intense now. It was like my legs were on fire, but it was a continual pain. It terrified me.
The ER doctors immediately suspect he has a neurological problem.
Because I became immobilized in such a short period of time, and because of the numbing sensation, the neurologist thought I had Guillain-Barré.
Guillain-Barré syndrome is a rare autoimmune disorder affecting the nerves outside the brain and spinal cord. If left untreated, Guillain-Barré can result in full body paralysis and even death.
The thought that I could be possibly paralyzed was terrifying. In order to be able to make the determination if it was Guillain-Barré, the doctor had to perform a lumbar puncture to check the fluid within my spinal cord.
But even as the lab technicians are testing his spinal fluid, Greg's condition seems to be deteriorating by the minute.
It kept spreading. At this point, the pain and the numbness was from my waist down to my feet. The pain medications they had me on weren't doing anything.
Each hour, it seemed like his legs progressed worse. I was asking myself, was he going to be able to walk again? Was this something that was life-threatening?
3 hours later, the doctor returns with the results of the spinal fluid and blood tests, which show absolutely nothing out of the ordinary.
I was terrified to know that the doctors had no clue what was going on. They were back to square one.
Then, just 6 hours after being admitted to the ICU, Greg is struck by a frightening new symptom.
Greg was laying there and he kept moving his legs. And I said, Greg, what are you doing? And he said, I can't keep my legs still.
My legs started to shake on their own, and I couldn't control it.
It looked like Greg was being electrocuted. It had gotten to the point that Ernest and I did not know what to expect the next hour.
At this point, the doctors wanted to do an MRI on my spinal cord and my brain so they could rule out multiple sclerosis, because the pain and the shaking is a symptom of multiple sclerosis.
Greg is immediately taken for an emergency MRI. Over the next 2 hours, doctors meticulously examine the images for any abnormalities. But they are left totally empty-handed.
Asked doctors what the next step was. Nobody tell me what was going on.
I was beginning to feel hopeless. I didn't know whether I would wake up the next day.
I felt useless because I could not help him. I could not take his pain away. And I couldn't get him out of the bed. I just had to sit there and watch Greg suffer.
And the next morning, to the family's horror, the mysterious disease begins affecting yet another part of Greg's body.
The pain and numbness spread to my right hand. And I thought it was going to take over my whole body.
I just didn't know how to handle it anymore. I was at the point that I thought I could lose my son.
When I told the doctor that the pain had spread to my hand, they still had no clue what was going on. The doctor said that if it spread and continued moving, that I could be possibly put on a respirator. I would lose the ability to breathe on my own.
Terrified that their son is slipping away before their eyes, Greg's parents decide that they can no longer trust the medical team.
I was afraid my son was going to die in that hospital. I demanded that Greg be transferred to another hospital.
After my dad talked to the doctor came back and told me that they were going to send me to Candler Hospital in Savannah, Georgia.
With his pain and numbness still spreading by the hour, Greg is loaded into an ambulance for the 100-mile trip to Savannah. By noon, Greg is being rushed into the ICU at Candler Hospital, where neurologist Dr. Julia Michael takes over his case.
It was clear that the situation was urgent. I was afraid this pain and weakness would creep up to his neck and paralyze him, because this implies a progressive situation that's moving very rapidly.
Dr. Michael seemed to be asking questions that the other doctors didn't ask, and she wanted to figure out what was wrong. So Dr. Michael performed a neurological exam, and she checked my reflexes, any sensation on my legs.
When I tapped his knees, his leg would jump and jerk and shake uncontrollably. This was clearly abnormal. And he had what we call Babinski signs. When we stroke the bottom of the foot, the toe goes up. The abnormal reflexes suggested there was some involvement of the spinal cord. When I did the sensory exam, every time I stuck his leg with a pin, it caused severe pain. He was so super sensitive. I had seen this constellation of symptoms in a patient before, so I had a hunch about what this might be.
Just 72 hours ago, Greg Sapp ran 5 miles. But now, a mysterious disease has stopped him dead in his tracks. Almost every part of his body is numb. Making matters worse, he's in agonizing pain, and doctors have no idea why. Now, Greg is in the hands of neurologist Dr. Julia Michael, who thinks she might know what's causing the incapacitating symptoms.
When I reviewed the spinal fluid information, it showed Greg had a white blood cell count of 25. Normal is less than 5, which did suggest that the spinal cord was inflamed. Based on Greg's examination and the spinal fluid, it was my conclusion that Greg was suffering from transverse myelitis.
Transverse myelitis is a rare neurological disorder. In healthy individuals, myelin, a fatty substance, insulates the nerve fibers in the spinal cord, allowing them to transmit messages from the brain to the rest of the body. But in patients like Greg, white blood cells go haywire, destroying the myelin and causing inflammation and damage to the nerves.
Transverse myelitis is often triggered by a virus that attacks the body. White blood cells trying to ward off the virus think they're attacking an enemy, and somehow the spinal cord cells look like the enemy viral cells. When the spinal cord is impaired, the body is not going to be functioning normally.
I was relieved that she was able to come up with a diagnosis, but at the same time, I was confused. I wanted to know more.
Greg first experienced a numbness, but as the disease got worse and worse, he developed pain because of damage to part of the spinal cord that controls sensation and pain. His legs were weak and would shake uncontrollably, which told me that the part of the spinal cord that controls motor function or muscle function were involved.
However, Dr. Michael can't explain why Greg got transverse myelitis in the first place.
When Greg came to us, it was apparent that the virus had been wiped out by the immune system, but the immune system had gotten carried away and was attacking the spinal cord. We don't know why in a patient with transverse myelitis, particularly a very young person, seems to have it spontaneously.
One thing is clear. Greg's lucky his father insisted on having him transferred. If the disease had continued progressing, it could have been fatal.
Patients who aren't moving their legs are very vulnerable to getting clots in their legs. Those clots can travel from the veins up to the lungs and kill you.
I was very grateful that Dr. Michael was able to figure out what other doctors weren't able to. I wanted to know how long would it take for me to be cured.
Transverse myelitis does not have a cure, but it can be treated. We started Greg on steroids because with the steroids we could block that immune system and calm the whole spinal cord down. But the effects of transverse myelitis can be permanent. It was really unclear what his future held.
It was terrifying because I didn't know whether or not I would be able to walk again.
We all just sat on the bed and cried. But Greg's a fighter. I said, it's just a battle we're going to have to fight. And he said, I'm not going to give in to it. And I am going to fight it.
2 weeks later, with his immune system under control, Greg is discharged. But now he must begin the process of getting his muscles back in shape through long and often challenging physical rehabilitation sessions.
Moving my legs was very painful. I was still not able to stand up. The pain and the numbness started to dissipate about 2 months after I got out of the hospital. 3 months after being discharged was when I took my first steps.
I came home one day from work, and Greg said, "Look, I can do it. I can't go very far, but I can walk." It was just a very joyous moment.
Now back on his feet, Greg begins learning more about his disease and is surprised to discover how rare transverse myelitis is. There are only about 1,400 cases diagnosed in the United States every year. But he still can't help but wonder why the doctors in the first hospital didn't recognize the symptoms.
Transverse myelitis is difficult to diagnose because it can look like Guillain-Barré syndrome, and it can look like multiple sclerosis, and also sometimes you can actually see the area of damage on the MRI. In Greg's case, we saw nothing abnormal in the MRIs.
Today, 2 years since his harrowing ordeal, Greg is still recovering and getting better every day.
Greg has made a lot of progress from when he left our hospital to where he is now. He could barely walk. He was plagued by pain. And now he walks with a cane. He's making the most of it.
And while the disease continues to take a toll on him, he's hopeful about the future.
I still suffer from numbness and pain in my right thigh, and I take medications to help with the pain. And even though I'm not able to run like I used to, I'm able to walk, and that's a big step.
Greg is even getting back into competitive racing.
Currently, I'm training for competition in the Marine Corps Marathon in Washington, D.C. I'm using a hand cycle where I use my arm strength to pedal the bike.
Greg is just ecstatic. He said, "I can't go run on my legs, but I can still enter marathons on this bicycle." Greg had a determination and a goal to reach for something, and he's reaching it.
Greg is my hero. I'm very proud of what he's accomplished.
Currently, I'm pursuing a degree in psychology. I want to help veterans who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. My advice to help other people that have the same problems is to keep your head up. 2 years ago, I never would have thought that I would be able to compete in a marathon. I had to put a lot of effort to be able to get to where I am now. Just never give up.